The Ortigia, on her previous voyage, had a collision in the same spot with a French steamer, and this fact adds strength to the belief that she was responsible for this morning's disaster. The New York Times, July 22nd, 1895. Though the two accidents were 15 years apart, the two disasters had some striking similarities. On both occasions, the Ortigia had struck an immigrant ship full of sleeping passengers at night. And, on both occasions, the Ortigia was found to not be at fault. Not only that, but on both occasions, the accident had happened off of La Spezia, Italy. It was enough to catch anyone's attention.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. I'm looking for a story about the Uncle Joseph and its collision with the Ortigia.
The archive's information on that collision is limited, but there is a story about the Ortigia with another vessel, the Maria P. Would you like to see both?
Yes, thank you.
Here we are. Enjoy.
The 1,870-ton Ortigia had been built in 1875 and had joined the fleet of the Florio line of Italy. The screw-propelled steamer was one of the larger ships that made up their fleet and was used primarily in trade between cities in Italy, as were many of the other Florio line ships. On the 23rd of November, around 10:30 at night, the Ortigia left port on one of these voyages, bound from Genoa to Livorno. On board was a crew of 44, as well as 36 passengers, under the command of Captain Stefano Paratore. Heading from Naples at the time was a ship called the Oncle Joseph, under the command of Captain Lacombe, and headed to Genoa. The 823-ton Oncle Joseph, which was part of the fleet of Compagnie Valerie of France, was also a screw-propelled steamship. The Oncle Joseph was named after Joseph Valery, one of the founders of the Valery line, and served as a mail steamer side by side with another remaining ship of the now bankrupt Valery line, the Columba. In October of 1880, the Columba broke down, though, and the first two voyages of the year for the Oncle Joseph had both been behind schedule. It was not good news for the Valery Line's contract, and the Valery Line terminated their contract to carry mail on November 12, 1880. It is speculated that, without mail to carry, the Oncle Joseph was now put to work in other capacities. And that was the reason that on the 23rd of November, 1880, she was off La Spezia, rather than on her usual route that brought her to Madagascar. On board, the Oncle Joseph had 264 passengers, mainly immigrant families who were intended to immigrate from Italy to Buenos Aires, and were going to catch a transatlantic vessel in Marseille. There were an additional 33 crew members. Two very different accounts will be told of what occurred when the two ships met. The first story was from Captain Paratore of the Ortigia. From 10:30 at night, when they had left Genoa, to around 2 in the morning, Captain Paratore had remained on deck keeping a lookout, but around 2 he had retired to his cabin, leaving his first officer in charge. Only an hour after he had retired, though, the voice of his first officer made him get up again with a shout, "There is a steamer running into us." Captain Paratore, on leaving his deck, said that he could see a large steamer a short distance off the port bow, and he ordered the helm hard a-starboard, and for the engine to be reversed at full speed. He was told that the first officer had already given these orders, and they were already being carried out, but it was too late. There was a collision. though Captain Paratore referred to the Oncle Joseph as being a large steamer. That was not true in comparison to his own large ship, which was almost twice the tonnage of the Oncle Joseph. The Oncle Joseph was struck near the starboard coal bunkers, which were filled with coal at the time, and the force of the blow was said to have nearly split the ship in half. Meanwhile, the boatswain, who was the officer on deck at the time of the collision on the Oncle Joseph, told his side of the story. Captain Lacombe of the Oncle Joseph had also gone to his cabin to rest for his leg of the journey, and he had left the boatswain as the officer in charge with instructions to wake him when they could see the lights of Genoa. The boatswain said that they traveled for some time, and that he successfully passed a sailing vessel astern when he spotted the red and green lights of another steamer. He turned the helm to port to avoid a collision course, but when he saw that the other ship was still coming at him without changing course at all, he turned the wheel further to port and rang the bell for the engine crew to be ready at any moment. Still, the other ship came toward them. And when he realized that they were inevitably going to be struck on the starboard side, the boatswain rang the ship's bell as violently as possible to alert everyone on board of the impending disaster. When the two ships did collide, it did not cause much of a shock on the Oncle Joseph, since it occurred at an angle to a compartment full of coal, which took some of the shock, but did not reduce any of the damage. It was clear from the moment of impact, which dug deep into the side of the Oncle Joseph, that the blow from the Ortigia had been a fatal one. The boatswain's first thought was to get out the Oncle Joseph's boats and save as many people as possible, but the ship was sinking too fast to organize such a thing. A sailor grabbed his shoulder, shook him, and told him to save himself. With this, the boatswain jumped on board of the Ortigia, and then started assisting other men to climb onto the other ship as well. He was not able to do so for long. The Ortigia quickly began backing from the hole she had created on the Oncle Joseph, causing people who were trying to climb on board of her to fall into the water. Captain Paratore of the Ortigia said that he had backed away so quickly because he was concerned that his ship would be dragged down with the Oncle Joseph when she sank. Worse still, the port bow anchor of the Ortigia caught on the Oncle Joseph, causing further damage to the already sinking ship, and ripping away her main shrouds and causing her mainmast to fall, seriously injuring the people who were trying to escape the sinking ship. As the Ortigia backed away, Captain Paratore gave the order to ready his ship's boats and to get ready for rescue work. Only minutes after the Ortigia backed away from the Oncle Joseph, Captain Paratore estimated as little as 3 minutes after, the Oncle Joseph went down. First Officer Perucchi of the Oncle Joseph had come on deck almost as soon as the collision had happened, and saw Captain Lacombe was also on the deck. Both men, on seeing that the boats could not be launched quickly enough, threw themselves into the sea. Perucchi could hear Captain Lacombe encouraging one of the sailors, who was struggling to swim since he only had one arm, to keep his courage and try to stay afloat. The sailor survived, but Captain Lacombe eventually sank beneath the waves. Perucchi swam for about another 20 minutes himself, and was beginning to become exhausted, when one of the Ortigia's boats found him and pulled him to safety. On board of the boat, he found one of the members of the Oncle Joseph's crew who had known the rough area the first officer was in, and had directed the boat crew to him. In total, 4 boats from the Ortigia, including one under the personal command of Captain Paratore, were launched on the life-saving mission. They only had torches for light, and the weather was described as becoming hazy, which complicated their efforts, and they mostly had to depend on the sound of people's cries in the water. After an hour, the cries stopped. And though the boats kept searching for another 3 hours, they were not able to find anyone else. They arrived in Genoa with the few that they had been able to save. In total, they had rescued 55 people, 23 of whom were members of the ship's crew. 238 people were lost in the accident. Most of the passengers who had been asleep at the time of the collision, and since much of the impact was absorbed by the coal, it is likely that they never even woke up until it was too late. Some of the people who were rescued were still injured enough that they had to be immediately hospitalized. The Ortigia was also badly damaged. Her bow was smashed in and took some time to repair, but she was soon back in service. There was one last survivor on the Oncle Joseph, though. The steamer, the Mary Louise, was traveling from Marseille, bound for Genoa, when they passed through a debris field near Cape Noli. Immediately, the captain ordered some of his men into boats to search for survivors, since it was clear that there had been a shipwreck, and he was unwilling to ignore the chance of saving lives. It did not take them long to find one. A man was clinging to a large table, and though he was still alive, he had been afloat with no food or water for 52 hours, and was not entirely sensible of the fact that he was being rescued. It took them a little while to convince him that he could release his hold on the table so that they could bring him on board their ship and nurse him back to health. When they found out where the wreck had actually happened, they were amazed at how far he had managed to travel carried by the tides. The Italian courts found the Uncle Joseph to have been responsible for the accident, though it was a decision that was always met with some skepticism from the people who heard the story of the accident. This would become more true as time passed, and the Ortigia continued to be tied to a series of collisions. After the Uncle Joseph, the Ortigia collided with the Martignan in 1885 with the loss of 12 people, and an unnamed Norwegian ship in 1890, leading to the loss of 5 people. The accident that brought the Uncle Joseph back into the public memory, though, was the Maria P. in 1895. The Maria P. was another Italian iron-hulled, screw-propelled steamer, just like the Ortigia herself. Though she was significantly smaller than the Ortigia, at only 722 tons. The Maria P. was built in 1886 and was considered a safe and well-maintained ship. She still had the highest certificate from Lloyd's, even though she was almost 10 years old. As she left Naples, bound for the River Plate, she had on board 173 passengers, most of whom were poor immigrant families hoping to start a new life. The Ortigia, meanwhile, had about 20 passengers on board, and was departing from Genoa. The two ships met off the island of Tino, with the Ortigia traveling at about 12 knots, and the Maria P. traveling at 10 knots. It was around 1:30 in the morning. It was a dark night, and the moon had been obscured by clouds. On both ships, the captains had retired to their cabins, just as with the collision on the Uncle Joseph. The officer in charge of the Ortigia was the third officer, and the officer in charge of the Maria P. was the second officer. Whether or not these officers were actually on deck at the time of the accident was later debated by the lookouts, though who on both ships charged that the mates that were supposed to be on watch had also gone below and were asleep at the time of the collision. The two ships did see one another, though very late, and they prepared to pass one another. No one is entirely certain what the miscommunication was, but the Maria P's course was altered, and it brought her broadside across the bow of the Ortigia. It was far too late for the mistakes to be fixed, and the Ortigia crashed halfway through the Maria P, even though, on the Ortigia, they had tried to reverse the engines before the collision. The Ortigia's engines were still reversing, and the Ortigia was quickly backed away from the sinking ship. Once again, it was estimated that it took a ship full of sleeping passengers that was struck by the Ortigia only around 3 minutes to sink. Captain Ferrari of the Maria P had been asleep, but had been woken up by the crash of the two ships colliding, and rushed to the deck. Realizing that the ship was sinking beneath his feet, Captain Ferrari threw himself into the sea and was rescued eventually by one of the Ortigia's boats. Absent from those rescued was a second officer, who was supposed to be in charge at the time of the collision, and would have had the most answers for what had caused the Maria P to find herself across the bow of the Ortigia. Though it was initially alleged that the Ortigia had not lowered boats, this was soon disputed, and it was found that they had stayed in the area until 8 in the morning, hoping to find more survivors, until they returned to Genoa with those that they had rescued. Among the rescued was a jeweler named Balina and his wife. They had been traveling with their 3 children, and the couple had run onto the deck with Balina carrying 2 of their children, and his wife carrying their 3rd. Weighed down by his children, though, Balina sank. He struggled to the surface, hoping that his children were still clinging to him, only to find that they were gone. Nearby, though, he could see his wife, who was clinging to a piece of wood and keeping afloat that way. She, too, had lost the child in her arms. The Ortigia's boats found them as well, where they were both clinging to the wood. Balina and his wife had lost everything in one moment. The only child who was saved of the passengers was a child of 8. He was the only survivor of a family of 7 that had also been traveling to establish themselves in Brazil. In total, the Ortigia was able to save 28 of the passengers and 14 members of the crew. The accident had cost 148 lives. The cloud that hung over the Ortigia after the collision with the Uncle Joseph meant that the first response of many people on hearing that the steamship had sunk another ship full of Italian immigrants was to immediately assume that the Ortigia was at fault. As the details came out, the blame began to be placed on the Maria P. The Ortigia was once again damaged and had to be repaired, but she would continue her career through World War I before being sold for scrap in 1919. She certainly could not be considered a lucky ship, but it was hard to consider her unlucky either, since she had survived every collision and met her end due to old age, rather than one of the tragedies she had been involved in.
For more information, please see the Flintshire Observer from December 3rd, 1880, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.